So we're going to go to John chapter 2, reading verses 1 to 11. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. And when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My time has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. And then he told them, "Draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." And so they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. And he did not realize where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This, the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed in Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. Weddings are usually big occasions. I think it's good to take the attitude that in all likelihood, and we understand there are always exceptions, very often more exceptions perhaps than we might like, but it could well be that this will be the only time that we get married, a couple might say. I want my wedding to be something special, a real day to remember. And so I think that's a real good attitude to hold. And that certainly would have been the case going back to Jesus' time, 2,000 years ago, that weddings were very big occasions indeed. The people there, they worked hard, but they also liked to celebrate hard too. They liked a good party. They liked to have, as we might describe it today, a knees up. Let their hair down. Celebrate. And a wedding was a perfect opportunity. The other opportunities would be some of the festivals and the feasts that were taking place, and some of those were very joyful occasions as well. In fact, it was forbidden that they were to hold weddings during feast times, because the idea was that they didn't want to detract from the feast and all the attention go on to the wedding instead, or vice versa. That when there was great celebrations, the religious celebrations taking place, that was the focus. But outside of that, it was good to have weddings. Now, I don't know about you, but I know of a number of people who are getting married shortly. Now, that's because, particularly as the summer months come along, it's wedding season, isn't it? It's the wedding season. And somebody was telling me that a little while ago that in their church, and when I tell you the figures here, you'll understand this is definitely not a Baptist church, but in their church they have something in the region of 150 weddings per year in the church. A very, very picturesque little church, and you can just imagine, can't you? I mean, if you take that roughly speaking, 50 Saturdays a year, and bearing in mind that most people want weddings on summer Saturdays, you can just imagine just how busy they are. So it's sort of weddings in the morning, weddings later in the afternoon, weddings during the week sometimes. I mean, they're just weddings, and up to 150 weddings per year. That's an awful lot of weddings taking place. And, but they're big, joyful occasions, and people want to make a big do of it. Well, I want us to come to this particular wedding and to see the big occasion that was taking place on this time. Firstly, we're told that the wedding was taking place in Cana in Galilee. So I want to look at the venue first of all. What do we know about the place where it was happening, the venue? Cana in Galilee was a place that only gets mentioned 4 times in Scripture. Each time it's in John's Gospel. 2 of them, it's mentioned by name here in chapter 2. Once it gets mentioned in chapter 4. And finally it gets a mention again in chapter 21. On 2 of those times, in chapter 2, of course, Jesus is there. And again in chapter 4, it mentions that Jesus went back to Cana, where he had turned the water into wine. And chapter 21 we'll come to a little bit later. But, so it doesn't get mentioned very much. It's a small town. Town is probably stretching it. A little village. A little group of people forming a community. Situated about 9 miles north of Nazareth. It was an agricultural community. What did they grow there? I don't know, but I suspect grapes were in the mix. I suspect they made wine there. If you visit Cana today, they certainly tell you they make wine there, just to sell to the tourists, of course. But it was an agricultural place. It was inland. It wasn't by the coast, either the Mediterranean coast or indeed by the Sea of Galilee. It was somewhere in the middle. And I suspect that the residents, the majority anyway, would have been relatively poor people. They wouldn't have been wealthy. They would have lived very simple lives. And you can just imagine that the whole idea of a wedding in this little community must have been the highlight of the year. What an exciting time for them. Guests were being invited from a wide area too. And we'll come back to the guests in just a moment. Other than that, what do we know about the venue? Not a lot, really. The wedding was not actually a religious ceremony. There would have been promises made, but it wasn't a religious ceremony as such. There would have even been perhaps a blessing, asking God's blessing upon the couple. But it was primarily a secular thing. And again, we'll come to talk about some of the customs in just a moment. But other than that, we don't know too much more. Perhaps it would have taken place in the streets, the houses being quite small. Thankfully, of course, the weather out there is quite kind, so you can get away with doing things outside quite a lot. Well, let's just look for a moment at some of the customs, because marriage back then was so different to what it is today. The marriage didn't start, of course, with the wedding. It goes way back. Firstly, very often they would have been arranged marriages. So something that most of us are not familiar with today. But, you know, that was their custom and that's the way it worked for them. You'll notice that there was also a betrothal period. Now, we know that, of course, from the story of Jesus' own birth. The English translations often put it something like this, that Joseph was engaged, or Mary was engaged to Joseph to be married. But engagement was actually something far more grave than perhaps it is today. Engagement today is something that, we intend at some point or other to get married. And then sadly, sometimes the engagement gets broken off. And there's no consequence to that. In Jesus' time, it was different. This betrothal period was a legally binding contract between the parties. And the only way in which it could be broken was through a legal transaction, essentially a divorce. But also we note that as well as being a legal transaction, that there was much more to it than that. There was a reason why they had this period of time. It would normally last about a year. That was a normal period for this engagement, about a year. And during that time, several things were happening. Number one is, of course, that there was a period of waiting after the promise had been made that the man would marry the daughter of another house. The period would wait for that period of time just to make sure, of course, that the girl wasn't pregnant anyway. That's the first thing. But I think there's something more to it than that as well, because there's something else going on here, because there's lots of preparations that need to be made. We would not be too unfamiliar with some of the ideas, actually, that were being used back then too. I wonder how many fathers today have said to their future son-in-laws, "How do you intend to provide for my daughter?" It's that kind of grilling that every future son-in-law dreads when the father-in-law takes him aside and starts to quiz him on what he's going to do and how he's going to look after this man's daughter. Well, in a sense, that was what they said then too. How are you going to provide for my daughter? And so it was the duty of the groom to go away and to make sure that he had made all the preparations necessary in order for the marriage to take place. And that would include providing a home. Now, if he was wealthier, of course, he might be able to go and get a plot of land. He might be using family money or something, and to build his own house. It might be actually building something on to his father's home. Perhaps there was a bit of land. He might just have to go, if he was very poor, and try and rent something. But he had to make sure that he had somewhere to take his new wife. But also, of course, that he had to make sure that all the other preparations were made for the wedding. And that meant providing, in some cases, particularly if he was wealthy, wedding clothes for the guests. We see that in one of the stories that Jesus tells. Certainly it would have involved in sending gifts to the bride, jewels that she would wear on her wedding day. If you look at the story that Jesus told, the parable of the lost coin, the coins were almost certainly a dowry that the woman had received, and she'd lost one of these denarius. When did the wedding take place? Weddings back then took place on either a Wednesday or a Thursday. Wednesday normally. Thursday was acceptable, however, and normal if it was a widow remarrying. Why did they do it on Wednesdays, though? What was the idea of having a Wednesday for a marriage? Well, it seems that the governing body, the religious governing body, the Sanhedrin, met on a Tuesday and on a Thursday. And therefore, if there was some reason that the groom believed that his wife-to-be had been unfaithful, he had chance to go back either before the wedding, or if he discovered that she was not a virgin, he could go back immediately after the wedding the following day and have the whole thing addressed. So there were legal reasons why they held it on Wednesdays. And so the wedding was going to take place on that Wednesday. The wedding lasted for quite a while. It wasn't just a few hours, but it would last for several days, some claiming even up to a week or perhaps even longer. A big celebration indeed. And then there's the custom that the groom would collect the bride. Now, bearing in mind that usually marriages were taking place in a reasonably local area, there was an awful lot of intermarrying between the locals. So it's unlikely that somebody in Galilee was going to marry somebody from right down south in Judea, say. Probably from the same town. And so, indeed, what they would do is that the groom, having got everything ready, having got the house ready, having sent out the wedding clothes for his bride, all the jewels for her so that she can get ready, having got the celebration and the party ready, having invited all the guests so that they are ready, and as they all arrive and everybody is there to witness this marriage, the next thing is that the groom has to go to the house down the street somewhere of the bride and collect her and bring her back to his home. And this would have been done after dark. And the guests would line the streets with oil lamps. And of course, we know, of the parable that Jesus told of the 10 virgins with their lamps. That's what it's all about. And they would light the streets, and so then they would come in this procession, a joyful procession with singing and dancing. And as they went along, coming from the bride's home to the groom's home, where the celebration would take place. Now, when we come to look more specifically at this particular wedding, let's ask ourselves a question about the guests. Who was present? There had to be a minimum of 10 guests present to witness the marriage. Well, we certainly know some of the guests that were there. In the first place, Jesus' mother was present. Now, that's not too surprising in a way. Nazareth, as I've already mentioned, was only 9 miles away. These are small communities. It's estimated by some that Nazareth had a population of about 500 people. Cana, less. So these are small community groups. Everybody knows everybody. They all end up working in the same fields, trading with the same people perhaps. Maybe because there was so much intermarrying throughout the communities, maybe it was even a relation. Who knows? We can't be sure about this. There has to be a reason why Jesus went back to Cana, though, as it says in chapter 4. Something attracted him there. So Jesus' mother was there. We also know that Jesus was present. And I think that we could probably guess that if Jesus' mother was present and Jesus was present, that his other family members were probably present too. But we also find here that some of Jesus' disciples are present. It doesn't tell us exactly who was there, but I suspect that not all 12 of the disciples were there at this stage in Jesus' ministry. But I think we can take a reasonably educated guess at some of those who might have been present. Peter, I think, was present. Peter's already been mentioned in chapter 1. Andrew, also mentioned in chapter 1, is probably present. How did John get all this information and all the detail of what was going on? Well, I suspect John was present. And bearing in mind that he was a fishing partner with Peter and Andrew, along with his own brother James, it suggests that probably all 4 of those fishermen were all there together. We've also had mentioned Philip. So I think we can assume that Philip might well have been present too. And then there was Nathanael, the one whom Jesus surprised as he went to him and told him things that Nathanael realized Jesus couldn't possibly have known about him. And he says to him, Rabbi, says, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. He says, how could you have known that about me? That's real insight that only God could have given to you. But in chapter 21, we find that Nathanael came from the town of Cana. So I think he was present too. I wonder what he was doing in Galilee, probably in Capernaum when Jesus first met. I wonder if he was running away. Lots of people coming from small communities like to run away to the big lights, don't they? Jesus found him and in a sense has taken him back, even if it's just for a moment. But they were all present at this wedding. What about the provisions for the wedding? What were they? Well, it was the groom's responsibility to make sure that the wedding had everything that it needed for all of the guests for the full duration of the wedding ceremony. But what we know is that very quickly the wine ran dry. There have been lots of speculation as to why there was no wine left. Some have kind of suggested that the guests were all a bit greedy. They were all getting drunk. Admittedly, further on, it does suggest that normally you only you give the best wine out first and save the lesser quality wine for when the guests have had a little bit too much. That's essentially what it says. Wine, however, was very seldom drunk neat. Wine was usually diluted. It was diluted sometimes 3 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes as much as 10 parts of water to 1 part wine. The whole idea of using the wine was the alcohol sterilized the water, which would otherwise have been unsafe to drink. However, I think it's probably safe to say that at a wedding, if it was diluted, they would have diluted it less than usual, shall we say. They wanted a happy, joyful occasion, and they knew the effects that wine could have. That doesn't mean to say that Jesus is condoning drunkenness, because actually quite clearly the Bible tells us not to get drunk in a number of places. It warns against that. So, what happens here when the wine runs out? Firstly, I think we can say that the wine probably ran out more likely because of the poverty of the family involved. Almost certainly they would have been a very poor family. The chances are that they couldn't afford any more wine. Maybe more guests came than they were expecting. Who knows about that, of course. But the chances are that they just didn't have the resources to provide everything they needed. That's an embarrassing situation to be in, isn't it? My parents have told the story several times of a friend's wedding they went to where very embarrassingly the reception ran out of food. I mean, can you just imagine it? Running out of food at the reception? Wow. It does happen. What about Mary, though, Jesus' mother? She seems to have a very officious role. Notice how she seems to be concerned over the lack of wine. Why is she taking it on her shoulders? Well, again, we don't know for sure, but I suspect that she was kind of part of the organising party. In those days, you didn't have wedding planners, as some today might go to the extremes of employing. Everybody mucked in together. And no doubt you had natural people who were used to doing these things and liked to get involved. And I suspect that Mary was one of those kind of at the forefront of it. You know, she spent, the previous 3 days baking quiches or something. I don't know. But, she was one of those sorts of people, I'm sure. She wanted to be there, to be part of it, part of that community. And she takes note that the wine has run out. The first person, of course, to have been told was almost certainly going to be the groom himself. It was the groom's responsibility to make sure there was enough wine and food at the party. If he couldn't provide for that, how was he possibly going to provide for his wife throughout the rest of her life and for his family? This was a test, if you like. And it looks like the groom is heading for failure in this first inaugural test. But Mary comes in and she turns to Jesus, her eldest son. Now we assume that Joseph, by this stage, her husband has already died. Now that means that the eldest son then takes on the responsibility of the father. The father's responsibility was to provide for his family. It was to protect his family. And so he would have become the main breadwinner for the family. He would have become the one who took responsibility for the family. He was the one who became the decision maker for the family. He was the one who took on the responsibility for looking after his mother. That was his role as the eldest son. And therefore it's not surprising that as Jesus hung upon the cross, that he turned and he hands that official responsibility on, interestingly, not to one of his brothers, but on to John, the writer of this gospel, who was almost certainly Jesus' cousin, certainly a relative. And he turns to him and he says, "Dear woman," he says to his mother, "here is your son." And he says to John, "Here is your mother." In other words, look after her. I'm going now. But I think there's something else here, and people have often queried the whole address that Jesus uses as he says, "Dear woman," and some translations knock out the dear and they just put it as it literally is, woman. But I think that there is a particular edge to this word that shows respect, and so I think it's valid to say in English, "Dear woman." Some have likened it to saying, more like, a term of respect like madam. But Jesus, I think, is addressing her in this way because something is also happening. This is the beginnings of his ministry. It's the same word that he uses, incidentally, as he hangs on the cross, as he commits her into John's care. But I think here he's saying things have changed. Remember that Jesus, at one point, as he's going about his ministry, creates a bit of a stir. And you find that his family are brought into, and he's told, "Jesus, your mother and your brothers are outside." And Jesus turns and he says, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers? I've abandoned them. They're no longer my focus. I've moved on from that. I now go about the work of my Father, not of my mother," as Jesus was to say. And I think here is this point really where he's saying to her, what is this to do with me? Because he's saying, I no longer take responsibility for you. In other words, I'm moving on to other things. Now my ministry is beginning. Somebody else must take care of your needs. My focus is the needs of a much wider group of people from now on. And we start to see Jesus drawing back from his family duties and responsibilities towards his ministry that he takes on. So Jesus says to one man, when he comes to him and he says, "I'll follow you, but first let me go and bury my father." Meaning, not that his father is dead, but, hey, I've got family responsibilities first. Let me go and sort those out, and then I'll come. And Jesus says, that's no good to me. I must come before family. The work of the kingdom is far more important, is Jesus' message that he's giving there. That's not to say, of course, that we don't have family responsibility still. We clearly do. That's another story altogether for another time. So I think Mary is turning to Jesus because that's what she always does. Some people have conjectured, well, perhaps it's because she knew and had some special revelation that Jesus was just about to perform a miracle. And that he could, but she had never seen Jesus perform a miracle before. Why should she even think that he's about to do that? Some have said, well, of course, the angel who visited Mary at the birth and told her all about Jesus and what he would be, and she treasured up all these things in her heart, and somewhere in all of that was the fact that he was going to work miracles later on. Or it could just be that every time the light bulb blew, she turned to Jesus and said, Jesus, can you change the light bulb? Jesus, the gutter is blocked. Can you unblock the gutter? The roles and the responsibilities that the eldest son took on in taking care of his family, his father's family. And I think that she's turning to Jesus and saying, Jesus, what are you going to do? We have a crisis on our hands. We're out of wine already. How are we going to sort this out? Now, seemingly she ignores Jesus' next statement, which is, I must admit, one of those statements that again draws those kind of theories and ideas from wide and far, because Jesus' response to her is, my time has not yet come. And usually when Jesus says words to that effect, he's referring to his death. He's referring to something in the future, and I think that that is the case here, though I think it was veiled to her. I don't think she fully understood what he meant by that. Again, we'll probably come to that in a short while. But I think that's what he meant. But she kind of ignores that and just says to the servants, do whatever he asks. If he says, go down the road and, see old so-and-so, and see if he's got a few bottles of wine around, then go and do that. She didn't know what Jesus was going to do. But Jesus sorts out the problems as part of his duty and responsibility. But what Jesus does is quite surprising, because he sees in the corner 6 very large jars that were filled with water used for ceremonial washings, and the Jews washed everything. They washed themselves before they ate, they washed their utensils before they cooked with them or used them in any way. Everything was wash. It was all ritual washings. And you had these great stone jars that were there holding, we're told, between 20 and 30 gallons per jar. Now let's take somewhere in the middle there, say about 25, that gives us 150 gallons of water that these things are capable of holding. If you work in metric, that's 680 litres of water. And Jesus says, I want you to make sure that these things are filled to the absolute brim. And having filled them to the brim, he says, now take some of the water out of it and take it to the head waiter, to the guy who's overseeing this whole thing. And taking this cup of water to him, he tastes it and discovers that he's drinking the best wine that he's ever drunk. Isn't it amazing that there isn't some kind of moment that is shared with us of exactly when the water became wine? Notice what it says in verse 9. It says then, back to verse 9, if I can find it. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had turned into wine. I mean, that's all it says. There's no sort of Jesus declaring water become wine. There's no big song. He just says, take the glass of water. You can just imagine that these servants were a little bit nervous as the man tasted the wine. I estimate that is probably the equivalent, with these 6 jars, of 2,500 cups of wine. That should keep them going for a bit. 2,500 cups of wine. Jesus doesn't do anything by halves. And it's the best wine. And you notice that the man who's in charge of the whole banquet, he then turns to the bridegroom. and says to him, normally you drink the best wine first, and then when they're all, sort of a little bit past discernment, shall we say, then they serve up the cheaper wine. But you, bridegroom, have kept the best till last. You see, it was the bridegroom's responsibility to provide and to make sure there was enough for all of the guests. So we've looked at the venue, we've looked at the customs, we've looked at the guest list, we've looked at the provisions. Finally, can I just turn to the celebration itself? The bridegroom was just saved from a very embarrassing situation. A very embarrassing situation. Had they have run out of wine, how awful. What a terrible thing that would have been to the guests themselves. It would have been rude to have invited them thinking you prepared and then not to give them enough. That would have been one wedding that no one would have forgotten. We've already mentioned that it said you saved the best till last. This wasn't the custom, as we've already talked about. I'm not going to go over that again. But I want you to notice that Jesus becomes suddenly the focus. Notice that Jesus didn't push himself forward. Jesus didn't make this big thing about turning water into wine. Jesus simply just says, take the cup of water to the man in charge. And very quietly he goes up to the groom and says, what happened? You've saved the best till last. Where were you storing this? But his disciples who are around him, who have seen this, it says in verse 11, put their faith in him. Jesus suddenly becomes a focal point. Now we know that he is who we thought that he was. We already believed that he was the Messiah. That was exactly what Andrew went and told Peter. Peter, I think we found the Messiah. Philip went and told Nathanael. Nathanael, I think we found the Messiah. Nathanael, who comes from Cana and knows Nazareth, which is 9 miles south of Cana, says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He's not just being sarcastic. He's saying, that dump? Seriously? Who is going to come out of there? Certainly not the Messiah, surely. No, nothing good can come out of Nazareth, is what he's saying from his own personal knowledge and understanding. But I want you to notice also here, finally, that as the bridegroom, the ultimate bridegroom that Jesus is, that he fully prepares everything. There is nothing left to chance. And I think it's significant that Jesus turned up at this wedding. He was an invited guest, which kind of puts his stamp of approval upon marriage. Shows how much he agrees with it. The very fact that he chose this to do his first miracle suggests that he endorses the whole idea. And we should too. But I want you to notice some of the things that Jesus said, because he's used this language of the wedding many times himself, either directly or it's indirectly used about him. Notice in John chapter 14, as Jesus is preparing to go to the cross, he says, I go to prepare a place for you. That's betrothal. Jesus says, he says, I'm going. He says, I'm engaged to you. You are the bride. You, the people of God, are the bride, and I am the groom, and I am now going to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms. There's plenty of space. Let me go and get one ready. And he says, if I go to prepare a place, I will come back and collect you. This is the wedding. He's saying there will become a time. He says, I'm going to go away, I'm going to prepare it, and then I'm going to come back. And I'm going to come and collect you, and the streets will be lined with the oil lamps as we head back to my home. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm fully committed. But also I want you to notice that he also provides everything that he needs to provide. For example, he provides everything that the bride needs. So Revelation chapter 19 and verses 7 and 8 tell us that the bride has made herself ready. The bride being the church, looking at Jesus coming again to come and collect his bride. The bride has made herself ready, for she has put on the things she was given to wear. Who gave her her garments for this occasion? It comes from the bridegroom himself. Jesus provides us with the acts of righteousness with which we are clothed, that we might be ready and waiting, adorned with the jewels that he provides, so that when he comes ready to collect us, that we will be ready to be his forever. And I think that there is significance as to why Jesus says, my time has not yet come, meaning this isn't my wedding. Yes, he's talking about his death, but not so much here about the cross, but he's talking about ultimately the whole thing, that my time will come when it will be my turn to take charge of the wedding, my turn to take responsibility for all that goes on. But for now, let me give you a little taster of what I will do for my bride too. Go and fill those jars with water, and you will discover the best wine you have ever tasted. Let's pray.